It is a strange thing to pursue a truth that is older than any of our records. To pursue a story that is underneath every other story. It is an odd thing indeed to enter into a story that has no beginning. And so I found myself in such a story as I knelt down and worshipped a child who was a king. I held his very hand in my own, and I squeezed it. It was real. What is history anyway, but the study of the hand of God in and over the stories of every other person? That's what history is. And I had studied history upon history upon history. I come from a long line of scribes, a whole family of scribes, all the way back. I can trace my ancestry all the way back to the great scribes who served under King Nebuchadnezzar. I come from Seleucia, where it sits on the bank of the Tigris River, where the waters of the Tigris lap up against the stone docks that are made heavy with the commerce of empires. And there I studied, and I read, and I learned, and I memorized every story I could find, every history of every empire, of every ruler, of every king and person that I could find. I became a veritable encyclopedia of stories. But there was one story that led me out of Seleucia and into Jerusalem. It was the promise of a king who was born to the Jews, the King of Kings. And so I came into Jerusalem hoping to find a great king, and there was a king in Jerusalem, that's for sure. He wasn't very great, though. Herod wasn't the first king that I had ever met. Fortunately, he wasn't the last either. But he was wholly unimpressive. It was obvious from the start that this king wanted to manipulate the story through deception. It was obvious from the start that I knew Herod's history better than Herod knew it himself. And so when he told me, go and find the king and then come back and tell me where he is so that I may go and worship him too, who did he take me for? Did he not know his own history, the history of his own people? Did he not realize that his own King Saul had tried something very similar once he realized that David would be a greater king than he afterwards? And furthermore, what king in history has ever willingly bowed down to worship another? No, I saw Herod for what he was, weak and foolish. Though maybe it wasn't his foolishness that drove him in that way, that he wanted to manipulate the story. Maybe it wasn't his foolishness after all. Maybe he was afraid. I say that because I experienced some of the same fear myself when, having left Jerusalem and followed that star into the little town of Bethlehem, and when we entered into that little house and we saw that little boy, and I held that little boy's hand in my own, and I gave it that squeeze, I felt a fear. I realized that here in this little boy was someone who knew my story better than I knew it myself. This was the King of Kings. As I left Jerusalem and realizing what it was that Herod had in mind, the violence that he wanted to do against this little boy, I made a vow to myself that I would never allow violence to ever impact the life of this little child. And maybe I'm the fool, because as I grasped his little hand and squeezed it, and I squeezed it just a little bit too much, I have to say. Perhaps it was the fear, perhaps it was the foolishness, but I squeezed it to the point where what was pink became white. And I squeezed, and I held, and he did not pull back his hand. And I thought, will this child, when the violence, which is inevitable, it will come to him, violence, you could see it in his face. It was written in his eyes that this child would come to violence. And as I squeezed and squeezed more squeezingly than I ought to, and as that child, he just sat there and let me squeeze, I realized that when the violence would come to him, he would not pull away. And I realized that this was a king who would be willing to let himself come to violence to save a fool like me. To pursue the truth. It's like wandering in an endless maze. To pursue what is really true in life, the truest thoughts of all mankind. It's like reaching for the stars. It's like wrestling with a shadow, like dancing with the divine. I knew a thing or two about seeking the truth, for I was born and raised in the great city of Alexandria, that city where East meets West, where the great thinkers of Greece mingle with the mystics of Egypt. There in the great library, I spent my hours and my days and my months and my years. There I debated the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. There I dismantled the writings of Zoroaster. There in the great library of Alexandria, there is where I pondered the celestial observations of the Chaldeans, the great library. That was the temple of knowledge. It was my home. But it was a star that called me out of Alexandria and into Jerusalem. And I walked into Jerusalem fully expecting to find nothing there but foolishness. And I can tell you, I was not disappointed. There's a little bit of pride, I suppose, in what I say, and that is an occupational hazard of mine. When one spends all of one's life seeking answers and then finds one becomes rather prideful. And I had found many answers to many questions. What is good? What is true? And what is the end of man? I sought those questions, and I thought I had found all their answers, and so no one could tell me anything in Jerusalem. Least of all, Herod. What a fool. There was a man who thought that he could manipulate the truth with lies. And as I exited Jerusalem on my way to Bethlehem, I realized that Herod made a mistake that, as it turns out, I too would be guilty of. For I also thought that the truth was a concept that could be wielded by a person. And what I was to find out was that the truth is a person. That's who I found in Bethlehem. A person, not just any person, a child. I had spent hours and days and months and years learning from the greatest minds in history. And so when I walked in and expected to meet the King of Kings, I fully anticipated someone who would speak words of wisdom to me that would send my mind in spirals. But he didn't say a word. Oh, he was just old enough, perhaps, to be able to speak, but he said nothing. He just looked at me, and there was something in his face that was unlike anything I'd ever seen in the face of another human being in my whole life, ever since or ever before. He had this, well, how shall I explain it? So in my work, I'm always chasing something, an idea, a thought, a question, a piece of wisdom. It's like dancing with the divine. It's like wandering through an endless maze, like reaching for the stars. It's just beyond my grasp. It's like trying to grab a hold of a shadow, and I'm always looking and always seeking and never really finding the thing that I needed most until I saw it in his face. I think you'd call it peace, though it's a kind of peace that is beyond my understanding. I knelt down because that's what I'm supposed to do. I don't think that I meant it really. But I knelt down and I gave him my gift, myrrh, the resin of mortality. And I left. And it wasn't until days later, as I was making my way back home to Alexandria, thinking like you do, haunted by that look of peace in his face, as if there was no question too great for him. And that's when I realized what a fool I was, after all, to have left him a gift like myrrh. That's the last thing he wanted from me. He didn't need my myrrh any more than he needed our frankincense or our gold. What he wanted, I did not give. He wanted my thoughts. He wanted my mind. He wanted my life as a gift. That I did not give. And because I did not give him my life, he would have to give me his. Oh, the stars. I have spent my life staring at the stars, listening for their voice. Nowhere on the face of the earth are the stars shining more brightly than in Ecbatana, where I was born and raised. Up there in the cool, crisp mountain air, you can't get any closer to the stars than in Ecbatana. Sure, it's just a summer home for the Median kings, but for me, it was home. I slept all day long, and I would wake up every evening, have my breakfast, and then look at the stars. The stars are very interesting. You see, they're very reliable. They're always exactly where you expect them to be, every single night. Oh, they move a little bit from one night to the next, but over the course of a year, there they are, right back where they started. And I looked, and I listened, because I wanted to hear the voice of the stars. To be honest with you, I was jealous of those seers and prophets that had come before me. And so in between observations and making my notes, I always had open next to me some prophet, Isaiah, for instance, or Micah, or Zephaniah. In fact, in Ecbatana, I had held in my own hands the words of the writings of the prophet Daniel. Surely he had heard a voice. Was it from the stars? Every night I watched and I listened, and no voice came. Very frustrating. Oh, I was seething with jealousy because I wanted to have a voice like Daniel. I wanted to have a voice like Jeremiah. I wanted to speak the words from above. And so that's where I kept my eyes, above. It's a good thing, too. If I hadn't been watching the stars, I would have never noticed when a new star appeared. That does not happen, but it did. And I don't know if it was a voice that I heard, but something said, "Follow me." So I did. It was the first time I had ever left Ekbatana. I didn't know what to expect. But I journeyed and I traveled, and that star led me to a great city, a city that, frankly, I was afraid to enter. Because you know the reputation of Jerusalem. It is not kind to prophets and seers. And there went I, a seer. And so, fearfully, I walked up the steps into Jerusalem. And fearfully, I threw myself into the arms of the king that we found there, Herod. And I have to say, I have no idea how I survived that one. Because it was obvious to me that Herod was not interested in any voice from above. He was interested in nothing other than his own voice, his own agenda, his own power. He was the embodiment of what the prophets had warned against. We escaped Jerusalem and followed the star even further until it led us to Bethlehem. It led us to a small village, and then a small home, and then to a small child, and I had brought gifts. Of course, I was a man of great wealth. That's my privilege in Ekbatana, and I brought gold for this king. And I must say that that little hunk of gold that I brought for that little child was by far the most valuable thing in that home. It was by far the most valuable thing in that home. Which was not what I was expecting when I came to see a king. The kings that I expected were wealthy and powerful. They had servants and riches beyond measure. I didn't expect my silly gift of gold to be the most valuable thing in the room, but there it was. As I knelt down to worship the child, I realized this child's voice was the voice of the prophets. This was the voice that they had heard. This was the voice that Isaiah had heard. This was the voice that Micah and Jeremiah and Zephaniah and Zechariah and Haggai and Hosea, this was the voice of the prophets. It wasn't a voice from the stars. It was a voice from God. And there he was, right in front of me. In poverty. As I left and thought to myself that I'm making my way back to Ekbatana, back to my wealthy and comfortable life of staring at the stars, well, I realized that I could not return to that life. not after seeing what I had seen, not after hearing that voice that was calling me away from my comfort, away from my security, and away from my little life in the clouds. And so I returned to serve those in poverty, to give to them what God had given to me. That's how the King of Kings calls us to be. Servants. Amen.